we'll go live in 3, 2, 1. Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is McKaylee. I work at Tattered Cover Bookstore, and first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Thank you for supporting local independent bookstores. Thank you for shopping locally. We would not be here during the last year, during this global crisis that we've had as a human race, or over the last 50 years without your support. That's right, Tattered Cover turns 50 this year, 2021, and we owe a large part of that lasting success to you, our community, whether it be virtual or hopefully in person again soon. Before I go any further, I want to let you know that closed captioning is available for those who might want it or need it. There's a black bar at the bottom of the screen with a button labeled CC on it. Click that button and closed captioning is enabled should you want it or need it. And a little bit about Tattered Cover for those of you who might be joining us out of state or haven't heard of our bookstore before. Tattered Cover is a local independent bookstore in Denver, Colorado. We have 4 locations currently, soon to be 5. We have our children's location opening in Aurora later this summer, and our Westminster store is slated to be opening later. So I guess that'll be 6 locations, hopefully by the end of the year. The best way to figure out about those new locations and get updates is to sign up for our email newsletter or follow us on social media at Tattered Cover on various handles there. But also you can find online is our web store. We have so many available titles that you can purchase online at tatteredcover.com. If you are local, please do feel free to come into the store, as 3 out of our 4 stores are currently open right now, as 1 is mid-move. So again, shop online at tatteredcover.com. If you want to come into the store, you're more than welcome to do that. We are open, and you can check hours at tatteredcover.com. Also on our website is our events. Oh my gosh, we have so many. I say that as somebody who's been hosting a lot of them. I'm very excited to welcome on some new event hosts as well. But one event that we have that might interest you viewers is David Gessner, whose new book, Quiet Desperation and Savage Delight, is going to be, we're hosting him on Monday, the 7th. We have so many. There is a book event for everyone out there on our event calendar. So you can check that out at tatteredcover.com/event. And now for the one that we have tonight, I'm very excited for. And I just now realized I did not ask the author how to pronounce his last name, and I'm so sorry, Michael.
No worries. You wouldn't be the first to mispronounce it. It's just Punke, Michael Punke.
You know, I was going to do something different because with my name being as weird as it is, you never know. But we have Michael Punke here tonight celebrating his new book, Ridgeline. And Michael is the author of several books, including The Revenant, a #1 New York Times bestseller and basis for the Academy Award-winning film. In his diverse professional career, Michael has served as the U.S. ambassador to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, history correspondent for the Montana Quarterly, and an adjunct professor at the University of Montana. As a high school and college student, he worked summers as a living history interpreter at Fort Laramie National Historical Site in Wyoming. You bet I'm going to be asking questions about that. He lives with his family in Montana and is an avid outdoorsman. And we're so excited to talk about Ridgeline tonight. And it's my honor to welcome Michael here. And I'm going to change the camera over so you can see both of us. Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for joining us and for clarifying your last name for me.
Hey, McKaylee. Thanks very much. Like I said, you're not the first person to mispronounce it, or you wouldn't have been. So I'm excited to be here. Thanks to Tattered Cover, too. I grew up about 200 miles north of Denver, and I've spent a lot of time at Tattered Cover over the years.
Well, we really appreciate that support. Thank you so much. And I know that we were talking before we hit the live button that it had been nearly 18-20 years since you'd been to Tattered Cover. So we're so excited to have you back, even in a virtual sense. Thanks for joining.
You too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I want to hear about Ridgeline. You know, some people may not have picked up the book yet, may be coming to it because they know you from The Revenant, but can you give us a brief summary about it, and then we'll dive into more questions?
Sure. So this is a novel, historical fiction based on a true event that took place in the Powder River Valley of Wyoming in the fall and winter of 1866. And there's a battle that is surprisingly not very well known called the Fetterman Fight, where a group of 81 U.S. soldiers were lured into a trap that was set by a combined force of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. And there was an enormous battle that ensued that was known as the worst defeat in U.S. military history for a period of 10 years until its place was sort of it was sort of pushed aside as the worst defeat by the Battle of Little Bighorn, which ironically took place only about 100 miles north of where the Fetterman fight took place. So the book is about the buildup over the fall of 1866 and all of the tension between an invading U.S. Army force and the indigenous tribes that were already living there, leading to this massive battle.
Wow, that's amazing. I want to quickly reassure our audience members and our viewers tonight that we are doing a Q&A session, so keep your questions coming that are already going in the chat. I just wanted to make sure that I promise I'm not ignoring you. We're going to do our questions first and we'll get to yours as well. Which is one of my first questions is, how did you stumble upon this story? How did it enter your life?
Well, it's when you read my bio, you read about my high school job, which turns out to be one of the most important professional experiences I had in preparing to write this book, because I had this great summer job in high school and college where I worked for the National Park Service at Fort Laramie National Historic Site, again, about 200 miles north of where you guys are in Denver. And my job every day was to dress up in an 1876 cavalry uniform and talk to tourists about the history of the West. And I wore this uniform. I fired an 1841 mountain howitzer cannon twice a day. We marched around with the period weapons and learned an awful lot about the history of that era, including a little bit, even at that time, about the Fetterman fight, which was something that, if you lived there and worked there, you learned a little bit about.
Well, I love that. How did you know it was something you wanted to write about, though? Especially, given your gap between one novel and the next. How did you know this was your next story?
Well, the process of going to look for a story as a writer, to me, is just a magical one, because you kind of have this whole universe of possibilities out there. And I oftentimes will just go into the library and sort of follow my nose for a period of weeks looking for a fun story or an interesting story. And oftentimes a story that looks pretty good in the beginning, either you discover that lots of people have already written about, or there's aspects of the story that just turn out to be not quite as great as you thought they were. The story of the Fetterman fight was just the opposite. First of all, it's got this amazing cast of real life characters, including Red Cloud, one of the most amazing Lakota chiefs in history. Crazy Horse is probably the most central character in the story. And to me, intriguingly, he's a relatively young man when this story takes place. So we're seeing him at a time in his life, really before he becomes the great chief that he will become, over the years that follow. As somebody who wrote The Revenant and is a lifelong Jim Bridger fan, I've got his picture on my wall back behind me. Jim Bridger in The Revenant, which is set in 1823, was a 19-year-old greenhorn on the frontier who's involved in this abandonment of Hugh Glass, but goes on to become a great man in his own right. In 1866, he's a 66-year-old scout for the U.S. Army, so he shows up there. There was great cast of characters. And then one thing I really love about it for historical fiction is, while there's a lot that is known about the incident that I write about, there's also a lot that's not known. And so it would be in some ways a hard book to write a nonfiction account of, because there's not as much of a historical record as you might want. It's perfect for fiction because the mileposts are all there, but there's a lot of space to fill in the gaps. And that's a lot of fun as a fiction writer.
Absolutely. Pardon me, I was still listening, but I'm getting some comments that my voice is a little bit low on the recording. So I did some adjustments there. Hopefully that's a little bit better. But I want to ask about your fiction writing process, right? And how it starts with research, obviously, and then what comes afterwards and where you fill in the gaps. So where did you start with the research process and filling in your own knowledge gaps before you started to fill in the fictional ones with the story and everything? Where did that research start?
So I love history and I take it really seriously. I've written a couple of nonfiction books set in the 19th century West, and I love the research part of writing. And I also feel like even with historical fiction, there's a huge obligation to get the history right. And I start by kind of reading everything that I can read about the incident in question, about the characters in question, and just try and be as well informed as I possibly can about what actually happened to the extent that we know. And then I think, though, in thinking about a novel, one of the things that's most compelling about novels at their best is they're not just about what happened; they're about how did it feel. And the characters in this story are ripe for that. How did it feel to be a Lakota warrior in 1866 and see your home invaded by an army that was obviously coming to stay? How did it feel to be a 19-year-old woman from the Confederate South who married a U.S. Army officer and thought she was going to be stationed with him in New York City, and instead gets sent to the most dangerous remote place on the continent at the time, and then is essentially locked behind the walls of this fort, and by the way, finds out she's pregnant, and by the way, finds out that her husband is sort of a Class A creep. How did it feel to be Jim Bridger, who had gone out on the frontier as a 19-year-old and for 46 years been part of the westward expansion of the nation, but I think was probably having some very serious questions about the world that he had helped to create at that point. So to me, this story had all of those kind of elements, both a just exciting, compelling historical adventure, but also those kind of human moments that make fiction meaningful.
Absolutely. And I have to ask about Frances. Like, I have to ask about her and her character. And you include her letters, or fictional letters, right? That's the way you chose with which to portray her and most of her voice. What led you to that decision to do letter writing, and what was so important about Frances that you had to include her in the story?
So one of the things I think, so first of all, the character that you're talking about is named Frances Drummond, and she's a real life character, like almost all the characters in the book. She's the 19-year-old from Tennessee who marries the army, the seemingly dashing army officer, and then ends up in a fort in the Powder River Valley in the middle of a war. And so, first of all, that was pretty compelling, just the sort of notion of this person being transformed to a place that was very different from where she had grown up. But one of the things I loved about the character of Frances is she wrote an autobiography. And so I could read the autobiography that she had written and really get a feel for what her first person voice felt like. And I loved her voice so much that I'm not aware of any actual journals of her actually existing, but women of that era oftentimes, and men too, wrote journals. And I've always loved reading journals as part of the research process, just because I feel like it's such a compelling way to get that feel for what history was like at the time. And so I had the idea of presenting her character through journal entries that she wrote. And then I had the further idea, because the role of 19th century women was so strictly circumscribed. They were, especially an officer's wife, was expected to sort of operate within very narrow parameters and act in a very specific way and react to things in a very specific way. And so I had the idea of her writing kind of an official journal that was her saying what she thought she was supposed to be saying, but then having a secret journal that she also kept, where she revealed her more true thoughts. And so her character is presented in the book through these two journals that she keeps, one kind of the official story and one her true thoughts. And all of that is happening over this period of time, as I mentioned, when not only is the situation of the U.S. Army disintegrating, but her marriage with her husband is also disintegrating as she discovers that he's not the man that she thought that he was. And that's all real. At least I think it's real.
Cool. It's true. It has such meat to it, this story does. But it also has a lot of moving parts. We have a lot of, because we're so closely connected with Lighthouse Writers Workshop and the recommendation writers, we have a lot of aspiring writers on here. And so sometimes we ask questions about craft. And one of them that I found very pertinent to do with your story is, what do you do when it comes to planning and weaving these stories together? Because you build tension so beautifully. Oh, we're gonna get show tell. Yeah.
I was going to. I think I can.
You build tension so beautifully. So how do you do it?
Well, I do a lot of outlining as a starting point.
That's virtual that we don't get otherwise. that kind of cool exclusive show and tell.
I'm a big believer in outlining, and really, to me, and I think maybe it's just because I'm not smart enough to keep track of stuff unless I write it down and kind of put it on a storyboard and move pieces around that way. But especially with this was a very different novel from The Revenant. The Revenant is a story essentially about one guy on a pretty linear trail trying to survive and then going out to get revenge against two other guys. That's a pretty contained story and pretty linear. This story has a very sprawling cast of characters. And it's one of the things I love about this story is there's so many different moving parts, but I'm not smart enough to keep track of those moving parts without writing them down and tracking them that way. And I literally spent a lot of time, kind of in front of that storyboard, moving chapters around. And as I would read and do more research and find some incident that I thought was really evocative as a chapter, I would make a quick note and stick that down on my storyboard someplace. So that's how I do it.
Thank you. That's great insight. And especially for somebody wanting to write these multiple plot points, figuring out how they come together as well. And I think it's fascinating that The Revenant and Ridgeline are so different, other than the fact that they're one word titles that also start with R. That, what did you do as a writer to evolve into being able to do the story, and how's it different than your first novel?
Well, I mean, I hope it's better, to be honest. And it has been, 18 years since I wrote a novel, and I'm proud of The Revenant in part because I, like other first-time writers, I wrote it, while I had another job and got up early in the morning and worked every day. And there's writing in The Revenant that I like a lot, especially some of the landscape writing and some of the action scenes. There's parts of The Revenant that I am not very happy with when I reread them. I mean, I had not written a lot of dialogue before, and there's dialogue in The Revenant that I don't like. I hope that I'm better at some of those things in this book. I wrote a lot of screenplays between The Revenant and now. And one great thing about writing screenplays is they are very focused on dialogue. They really put a spotlight on dialogue, and I think that makes you better at writing that. And so, I mean, that's an example of where I hope that I've evolved some and gotten better at the craft. One other thing that was different in writing this book is I wrote The Revenant. I grew up in the West, but I wrote The Revenant when I lived back East. And I wrote this book very much here in my home in Montana. And I am outdoors every day, one way or the other. And I'm much more in touch with the natural world, frankly, living here now. And to write in the midst of that, especially as it relates to Native American characters, as it relates to a character like Jim Bridger, who was a frontier scout, that was a lot easier to do living in the midst of this environment that I live in now, as opposed to the one that I was, living in when I wrote The Revenant.
Absolutely. And that leads me great to my next question, which is, in your opinion, how important is setting? Can you talk more about that in your novel?
Well, look, for a Western, I think setting is more than just a backdrop. In Western literature, the best Western literature the land is a character. And it's when you live out here as we do, whether it's Montana or Colorado or Wyoming, you have a respect for not only for the beauty of the land, which we all appreciate, but if you spend time outdoors on an ongoing basis, you also have a respect for how brutal it can be as a force. And again, being here to write this and going out in January and hiking in deep snow and feeling the wind on my face and, having it blow the water out of my eyes and the tears freeze on my cheeks. I would go back from a hike like that and remember that and could bring that to bear in a way that I think was helpful to presenting the story.
No, that's great, because it's something that, the West has in a weird way, the West and the idea of it hasn't necessarily evolved into meeting the modern East Coast, West Coast worlds. There's a certain, not jadedness that I want to say, but there are cities here that are big and up and coming and stuff, but people still think of the West as outlaw country and wide open spaces. And so I'm curious about writing a book that sort of idealizes that that time and that space that we still think of it while living in a modern world. And I know you're doing historical fiction, but I'm curious about that dichotomy that is now in the West.
Well, it's an interesting question, and there's lots of different angles to it. I mean, one thing I love about the West is, and I'm going to bastardize this quote, so apologies in advance, but there's a quote by Wallace, I think it's attributed to Wallace Stegner, and he says that that the West is America, only more so. And I've always loved that quote because to me, it kind of speaks to the idea of the West that is very much a part of the American spirit. And what's interesting about that in part, and what I think I try and focus on a lot in this book, is that romanticized version of the West and that idealized West as a place of potential and hope is rightfully an important part of the American spirit. But there was a huge conflict built into that. And that manifest destiny idea of going West ran full force into civilizations that were already here. And there was a huge cost to the civilization that was established in place of those earlier civilizations. And that conflict to me is important for us to understand as a people and as a nation. And it also is just inherently dramatic as a story. It's a hugely dramatic period in our history.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm saying absolutely a lot, but it's true. I agree with you. And so, which leads me to another question, because I think about, the American West and the idealism, and, we're taught in schools about the gold rush and Oregon Trail and those types of things, but we're not taught necessarily about that conflict and what settlers encountered with the civilization that was already there. And so can you speak more to your research dealing with indigenous cultures and any input that you had from them directly when
Sure.
Recounting their history in this way?
Well, as I mentioned, this is one of the things that was extremely important to me, in part having worked for the National Park Service in the 1980s and told kind of the official story of the American West as part of my job as a teenager. Even then, it was apparent to me that there were big parts of the story that we were leaving out, namely the role of Native Americans in Western American history. We were just starting to talk a little bit in the 80s about the role of women, but we were not talking at all about the role of Native Americans, certainly not in any historically comprehensive or accurate way. And so to me, in telling this story, it was critical that all of the different voices in that story be represented. And I've always, Crazy Horse has always been a hero of mine since I was a boy, and he's such a compelling character. And but that said, I felt a huge responsibility to be respectful and accurate in telling that part of the story. And so, my method was, first of all, to do as much research as I could, including reading a lot of Native American historians who have relied in significant part on some of the oral history of that era that is more representative of the Native American perspective. Once I had a draft, I shared it with ultimately about 9 different Native American readers from 6 different tribes, and just asked for their reaction and feedback. And I changed a lot of things on the basis of the feedback that I received, and hopefully was able to have a better finished product than I would have if I had tried to do it on my own. So I feel it's vital to tell a multicultural story with all of those characters portrayed. But there's a huge responsibility that goes along with that, which I hope I've lived up to in taking that seriously and trying to get it right.
Yes, and I think that sensitivity readers are such a huge part of publishing, or actually they should be bigger, in my opinion. But that's really great to hear that you were able to get feedback and be able to improve from there.
And by the way, the mistakes in the book are all mine, and I'm sure they're there. But I also do feel like at a certain point, you do the research, you share it as broadly as you can, you incorporate the feedback, and then you kind of put it out there, and you hope that you move the discussion forward. And so hopefully people won't find too many mistakes, but if they're there, we can use that to move the conversation forward too. So that was kind of my method.
Well, and I'm curious about moving the conversation forward. If your book is a doorway, so to speak, into learning more about this era, the Indigenous peoples, and their journey and their perspective from that time, in addition to just honestly the West in general. I know this sounds silly, but when I was younger, we were taught like North and South, and it all was in the East. Well, no, there was a lot going on in the West during the Civil War times as well. And what are some resources, or maybe what are some resources that you use that you can share with us, that if people are more interested after reading Ridgeline, that they can?
One of the things I did in The Revenant that I repeated in Ridgeline is I have a lengthy section at the end after the story's done called Historical Notes, where I tell the readers where I took liberties, and there aren't very many places, I hope, but if I did take liberty with history, or if there was another interpretation that I felt like people should know about, I write about that in the Historical Notes. And I do that, number one, because I really, I think epilogues are interesting. People are always interested in, well, what happens next? But also because I want to be as clear as possible about what is factual even in a novel, a work of historical fiction. But one of the things I do in the Historical Notes is I send people, if they're interested, towards other resources that they can read, including, for example, there's a great book by a Native American author named Joseph Marshall III called The Journey of Crazy Horse. And it's a nonfiction book about Crazy Horse that I found to be one of the more interesting accounts of his life. And one of the reasons I found it so interesting is because Marshall does such a good job of putting Crazy Horse in his cultural context. One of the things I did, one of the questions I asked the Native American readers who looked at this book ahead of time is what else should I be reading, or what other books would you recommend to people? And so I list some of those resources in the Historical Notes as well, so that people can be directed towards those resources. Again, there's no perfect way to wade through a complex topic like this, but I hope that I've I've made a big effort here to kind of broaden out the discussion.
Absolutely. And that's why I think historical notes in the back of books like that are wonderful. And I love that you did it for The Revenant and then continued for Ridgeline as well. So I have one more question before I move to our audience questions, which, by the way, people are recommending books and they have their own comments about
Excellent.
what you're reading and stuff. So people are excited about that too. So I'm excited for your questions in the audience. So please keep them coming and keep gearing them up. But I want to ask you about the title. This is always something that I find very fascinating when talking with authors, is how the title came to be, who influenced it, because as we know, it's not always what is on your document draft, but why Ridgeline?
So I'm going to do another visual here. I don't know. We'll see how well this works. I am very lucky to sit and write every day in a place where I look out at a really lovely ridge line. And so, I stare at a ridge line, a beautiful one, every day. And as I said, I go out and I hike every day, and oftentimes to the top of that ridge line. And, this is a battle that takes place when a group of soldiers faithfully ride over a ridge line. But on one of these hikes that I took when I was in the early months of working on this book, it really occurred to me as I was trudging up towards the ridge line. I love crossing ridge lines when I hike, because it's this demarcation line between what we know and what we don't know. And when you get to the top and look over and you see what's beyond, it's a big moment in exploring a piece of country. And I loved it as a metaphor for people's lives, and every character in this book literally is at this crossroads moment in their life. And each of them, in one way or the other, is trying to gain some measure of control against tumultuous times. And maybe that was something that related to me, writing a lot of this during COVID, for example. It's something to me that felt very contemporary. And obviously, if you're a Lakota in 1866, you're dealing with something that's on an even different level of horror. But it has been an interesting year for all of us in dealing with tumultuous times and change. And so there's some very contemporary sentiment, I think, that the characters in this book are grappling with that are important today. And for me, those are ridgeline kind of moments.
I am not disappointed by that answer. I love
Okay,
it when
good.
I don't have multiple meanings, and that's my book geek coming out a little bit more there. Well, thank you for our part of the discussion, Michael. And
Thank you.
I know that our audience members are going to have some great questions in here too. Some of them, I'm going to start with a couple of them, which are like book recommendations that people have asking, like, have you read?
Yeah.
Did you read Joseph M. Marshall's? You mentioned him, 100 in the Hand.
I did not read that book because that one is a novel about the battle, and I didn't want to read another novel about it just because I didn't want to have somebody else's, I think, kind of interpretation of the battle in a novelistic way. Yeah. The one that I did read another one of Marshall's books, though. I'm trying to. It's another nonfiction book. I may get the title wrong here, but it's really about more of a lot of the philosophy of the Lakota. That was another book that I thought was very interesting.
Nice. Another one was A Terrible Glory Cluster and the Little Bighorn by James Donovan.
Not read that one. Sounds interesting.
I know, it's kind of cool. We're getting a huge TBR list here, everybody.
Yeah, no doubt.
Start with Ridgeline and head with these. And so another great question here, actually, this is going into the writing process, has to do with how was it writing fight scenes and battle scenes, especially from a historical fiction perspective?
Well, I found the battle, and by the way, there's battles throughout this book. What was basically happening in the fall is Red Cloud sent out small war parties, including one that was led by Crazy Horse, to harass and attack the army as it's trying to build this fort as part of Red Cloud's effort to learn how the army would react. And all of that is the setup to this huge battle that happens at the end. So I love writing action scenes. It was one of my favorite things about The Revenant. I like to read books that have action scenes in them. I love the combination of a book that has a lot of action with a book that also has kind of some interesting, more philosophical or historical stuff going on. And I hope that that's kind of where Ridgeline lands. But the biggest thing to me in writing especially the last battle scene was traveling there. And I spent days wandering. It's a huge area. It's miles long and miles wide, and it covers this beautiful valley at the foot of the Bighorn Mountains. It's a Wyoming State Park now. You can go visit it, and I recommend you do. But I spent a lot of time walking the battlefield just to think through, what happened, because there is, even with the oral history accounts that we have from survivors, there still is a lot of mystery about what happened, where, and when. And that, again, was a fun part of writing a novel.
I like this next question here too. I'm gonna get the audiobook of Ridgeline as well. How much were you involved with that? I think Tantanka Means is one of the narrators.
So I was very involved in helping to pick the narrators, and it was great that the publisher let me do that. I felt super strongly that the main narrator needed to be a Native American, because, as I said, the most important, there's a lot of characters, but the most important one is Crazy Horse. And I just thought that it would be more powerful to have a Native American read that, be the main narrator. And the main narrator is a great Lakota actor named Tatanka Means. He's actually the son of Russell Means, who was a leader of the American Indian movement and then also an actor. But Tatanka is a fantastic actor. He does a great job narrating this book. They also hired a woman named Amanda Stribling, who reads the journal entries of Frances Grummond. She's from the South, and I think that has just the perfect amount of Southern accent for Frances Grummond. So I finished listening to the audiobook a couple days ago and really enjoyed it. And I think people will too.
I'm going to do a quick plug here for those of you to support local independent bookstores. You can always get audiobooks at libro.fm, the exact same price as Audible per month. And this way you get to pick and choose your independent bookstore to support through libro.fm. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe Ridgeline's on there too. So you can support that way and get the fabulous audiobook on that level, which we would greatly appreciate, because proceeds go back to us when you purchase through Libro. So also being said, on being involved in projects, any word on a Ridgeline movie? Would you even want that to happen?
I would want that to happen. I'll be perfectly honest. And the good news is we actually optioned the TV film rights to Ridgeline to the same company, Anonymous Content, that produced The Revenant. So I'm very hopeful on that front. Anonymous Content is a great and really a creative force in Hollywood, and they're on the case. And so I'm fingers crossed. We've had a lot of discussions about Ridgeline as a film versus Ridgeline as a scripted series, and there's advantages to both. And I would be, for different reasons, I guess, happy with either.
When I was reading the story, I saw it as a miniseries of being able to follow like one perspective every other episode, or following, because so help me goodness, if they cut Frances and you do a movie and you cut Frances out, I'll be so mad.
Well, they won't cut her on my watch, I'll tell you that much.
There you go. So I like this next question too. Is there a Crazy Horse book in the near future for you?
I don't know what I'm going to write next, is the truth. And I've kind of just started thinking about that. I think I will definitely stay in the 19th century American West. That's kind of, I just love doing the research on that. Um, and one of the things I love about the 19th century American West is I think it is full of contemporary lessons. And so I'm kind of looking for that 19th century story that I think has interesting 20th or 21st century lessons. But I'm not married to any idea yet.
Well, you also just came out with a book, so that's always a hard question to ask an author during their premiere
That's
author
true.
event tour.
Yeah.
So I got two more questions here before we close out this evening, and one of which I really like. What advice do you have for historic fiction writers and language? How do you make sure that you get the voice accurate for the time period?
So that's a really tricky one, and it's part of writing good dialogue. Um, I mean, part of it, I think, is the research that you do, including things like reading journals, and that is a fantastic way to just feel what the cadence is of people's language in a different era. Not only the cadence, but also the vocabulary of a particular era is obviously different. And a lot of times doing research, you'll come across words that you just didn't really, you kind of know what it means, but you didn't really know it before. And you just know that that's the perfect word because it's just something that you can imagine someone saying in 1866 versus today. So there's a lot of that. I was very mindful in writing the Native American characters of being very careful of not having it sound like a 1950s Western. And so hopefully I pulled that off. But it's a lot of research, I think, and then it's a lot of practice writing dialogue, because writing dialogue is different than writing prose, and you just got to do it. And then I read it out loud, and when I read it out loud, sometimes it sounds like it could actually be said, and then I feel like it's pretty good. And sometimes I'm like, nobody would ever say that. And then I'm, editing. So that's one way of testing yourself.
I like that. I like that a lot because reading out loud, you think about actors with movies and plays and everything. They have to start with the script. They have to start with what's written in order to be able to say it. So having it out
Yep.
loud is a great idea. So the last question that we like to ask around here at Tattered Cover for our author events, interpret it as you will. But Michael, what did Ridgeline teach you?
I guess the one of the kind of central lessons of Ridgeline, I think, is the consequences of good and bad leadership, which is an evocative issue for me in the era that we live in today. But what was really interesting was not the characters who were most obviously villains. And there's one in particular that I think stands out in a historically accurate way. And that character is easy and fun to write. And, if they look bad, they deserve to. But what was more interesting in terms of the leadership question is, what were the people around that leader doing, and how were they reacting or not reacting, and how were they deluding themselves about whether they were somehow controlling this person behind the scenes, and how did that work out for them? And so, this is not a political book, but I think there are always lessons to be learned from history about contemporary times, and certainly those leadership lessons. And leadership comes through profoundly on both sides of this story. The Red Cloud, as a leader, I think is one of the most amazing leaders of all time, both in terms of his diplomatic skill and his strategic military skill. And that's something else that I think comes through that will maybe be something that people don't know as much about.
Even as you said it, I'm looking at the book in a different way, because
Excellent.
that idea of, oh, Crap. Now, I guess now I have to go listen to the audiobook and read it again.
Well, there you go.
In that way. I want to thank you, Michael. This has been such an enjoyable conversation. And I want to thank our viewers for such excellent questions and insightful questions. This has been really enjoyable for me, and I do a lot of these. But I want to give you the chance to remind people who you are, where they can find
Sure.
you online, and anything else that you want to say before we close out this evening.
Sure. Well, Michaela, thanks very much for being such a great interlocutor, and thanks again to Tattered Cover and to everybody who's listening. My kids say I'm bad at it, but I am on Twitter at mpunke, MPUNKE, and I'm on Instagram at MWPunke, PUNKE. So I put up a lot of pictures from the hikes that I take, including some of the ridge lines that I've described. And we'll be putting some stuff up over the course of the next few days, in particular from the research that I did for Ridgeline. So if that's of interest, it'll be there in the coming days.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. And we're Tattered Cover Bookstore. You can find us on social media or on our website at tatteredcover.com, where you can also get your copies of Ridgeline. It is one hell of a read.
Hey,
and I want to encourage, my pleasure. I want to encourage everybody, like I said, to shop locally, get your book in store or online. We cannot thank you enough. Truly. For some of you out there, it's dinner time right now. Maybe think about ordering from a local mom and pop shop, or going out and sitting outside if you can. Local businesses need support from their communities more than you will ever know. Michael, if you'll stick around while I just close this out here. This has been In Conversation with Michael Punke around his new novel, Ridgeline, which you can get today at tatteredcover.com. Stay safe, everybody, and happy reading. Good night, all.
Thanks, everybody.